I'm going to hand it over to Alexandra, who's our guest speaker tonight, talking about her experiences with virtual fencing.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Katie, and I will just get my screen shared here. Okay, share there, and then I'll just make sure that I do the sound. Yep, okay. And hide okay. Everybody should be able to see my screen again now, hopefully.
Yep, that looks good.
Okay. So, good evening, your time. It is still just the afternoon for me. So, greetings from Edmonton. My name is Alex, and I'm really excited to be here with you and the OFCAF program today to talk a little bit about virtual fencing. A little bit about me and why am I the one who's here talking to you about virtual fencing. I grew up in Manitoba originally, and my family had a small cow-calf operation. But that ended quite a while ago. That ended in 2002 with the BSc and everything. So since then, I haven't been directly in agriculture or farming, but I did do my undergrad in Winnipeg at the University of Manitoba, focusing on agriculture and beef production in particular. I just sort of stumbled into virtual fencing in about 2021 because I had just, throughout the COVID pandemic, I wasn't doing much in Winnipeg, so I decided to move to Edmonton to pursue a master's degree. And the person who I was talking to be my supervisor, Dr. Edward Bork, he offered me, he just sort of casually said, "Hey, do you want to try doing this virtual fencing project for your thesis?" And I had never heard of the technology before, and I was highly skeptical at the idea of, invisible electric fencing. But I thought, why not? It seems like a pretty good idea to work with some new cutting edge technology. And then it just sort of took off. So I got really lucky being able to work with this tech in its early days, and I'm very excited to share it with you. Before I get started, maybe if anybody wants to, well, it's hard for me to see you. Is anybody never heard of virtual fencing before or is pretty unsure about what it is? Um, Feel free to, shout it out or put it in the chat.
If you can't see things in the chat, I can read them out.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I can't see the chat when I'm presenting, so.
Okay.
And also, if you came to this webinar hoping to get something specific out of it or really hoping to learn something in particular, also feel free to type that into the chat and Katie can read those out to me and I'll try to make sure I answer your questions as I go along. So, uh, I'm sure some of you have heard of virtual fencing. Some of you might be really familiar with it, and maybe some of you have never heard of it before. So, virtual fencing is basically an electric fence. It's a new technology that works like an electric fence, using electric shocks to keep cattle out of areas we don't want them in. But instead of using physical barriers like an actual fence does, it uses invisible barriers based on GPS. It's a new tool, or it's a new tool or technology that can really increase your grazing management flexibility or increase the things that you can do while grazing cows. So, giving you a lot more control over where your livestock are grazing, for how long they're grazing. You can move them around a pasture with a high degree of detail and precision. And the idea is that it reduces the fencing infrastructure and labor that is required for this sort of more flexible, more controlled grazing management, especially for things like rotational grazing or targeted grazing, because you don't need to add miles of cross fencing to a pasture to, rotationally graze your cows by moving them every day, for example. So, it's a sort of a two-part system. The first part is the actual software that lets you create and adjust these virtual pastures. This picture, I think I can do Laser pointer, yeah. This picture here is an actual screenshot from my phone that I was using during my research. So this is just what it looks like when you're creating or editing a virtual pasture. And usually this software is available either on the computer or also on a phone. And then the second part of the system are these livestock collars. So this is what the livestock wear, and it tracks their location in real time using GPS. And when an animal, it basically is what's responsible for controlling livestock movement by using audio warnings followed up by electric shocks. So you use the app or the software to create the pasture, and then the collar tracks where the animals are going and gives them a warning and a shock if they get too close to the boundary. Sort of how this works is, say you have a cow, like right here, and if they're wearing a virtual fencing collar, so your cow is hanging out in the grazing area where you want them to be. They're being a good cow. And then because it's an invisible barrier, they don't know where the fence line is, so they wander towards it. So as the cow gets close to the virtual fencing boundary, which is represented by this red line, they enter this, boundary zone, and then that triggers the virtual fencing collar to give them an audio warning. If the cow stays within this effective boundary zone for the duration of that audio warning, the cow then gets a shock. So cows are trained that when they hear an audio warning, they will get a shock unless they turn around and walk away from the virtual fencing boundary. So very similar to a physical electric fence, but instead of seeing the barrier, they're hearing a barrier instead. And as I'll show you in a little bit, this is a shockingly, to some, shockingly effective system. In Canada, there are three virtual fencing technologies that are currently being used, but only one of them is actually commercially available. So eShepherd by Gallagher is the only virtual fence technology that's commercially available to anybody in Canada. The other two virtual fencing systems up here, No Fence and Vents, are being used in Canada for sure, but they're on more of a demonstration researcher stage. So you can't just purchase these collars and start using them. The producers who I know who are using these systems either went through a university or a college and are working with an academic who bought the collars themselves, or for example, Vents reached out to a few producers in Saskatchewan directly to set up some demonstrations using their collars. So if you are interested in not using eShepherd, there are still ways to try out these collars. So this is a compare. I know there's a lot here. Don't worry, you don't need to read it all. I just wanted to show you that this exists to give you an idea of some of the differences and similarities between these virtual fencing systems. This is a comparison chart that the University of Arizona created, and it's accurate up to October of this year. All the costs are reported in US dollars because it was made in Arizona, but they are accurate as of just a couple months ago. So I want to point out, because eShepherd is the only one that's available in Canada, I just want to go through some of these aspects to the technology with you. So eShepherd is controlled by software that's either on the computer or your phone app, so it's pretty flexible. The collars communicate with the software either directly through the cellular network, or if you're in an area where the cellular network isn't reliable or just isn't there at all, you can also use base stations to relay the information from the collars to the software. The collars are powered by solar charged batteries, and the manufacturers say that they have a lifetime of 7 to 10 years, but the technology is so new, nobody's really been able to verify that yet. No maximum herd size, no maximum pasture size. And then the cost for eShepherd, and again, this is in US dollars, I didn't do the conversion, anywhere from $250 to $350 US per collar, as an upfront cost of purchasing those collars. And then if you need to add base stations, that'll be an extra $5,000 or $6,000 per US per base station. And then there's an annual fee for every collar as well to cover things like maintenance and support and cellular network usage, etc. The one thing about eShepherd is that they currently only have collars that are designed for cattle available. No Fence, which is the virtual fencing technology that I used for my master's thesis, also has collars that can be used on cows, but also specifically has small ruminant collars that can be used on goats and sheep. I'll give you guys a link to this chart later so you can take a look at it. I just don't want to take you through every single technology that's on here. So yeah, like I just mentioned, I used the No Fence virtual fencing system for my thesis research. And basically, the whole point behind my project was I wanted to see, does virtual fencing work in Western Canada to, to graze cows the way that Western Canadians will graze cows. I know you folks are in the East, so it's not as I didn't do my research in the East, so it's not as applicable to you, but it's still better than having 90% of the information coming from Europe and the US, and it's still going to be really applicable to you. So my main goal was to see, could I use virtual fencing to rotationally graze both heifers and cow-calf pairs across multiple years in the Aspen Parkland region in Alberta. So that region is, here's a picture from where I did my study actually, and you can see that there's the rolling hills and it's, a very patchy kind of landscape with a little bit of topography challenges, but not as much as a mountain, for example. And in particular, I really wanted to see, would the collars even work in the summer and the winter? Because being Canadian, we know that lots of technology tends to break down in the winter. So how did I do that? Well, I ran 2 different rotational grazing trials, 2 summers in a row. The first year, I had 49 heifers accompanied by two bulls, because this was like a functional cow-calf ranch, and so it was a breeding herd. And I took them through a rotational grazing scheme for 3 months from June to August, rotating them about every 5 to 7 days. And then I took them out at the end of August, and they just were held in regular pastures over the winter, and then they calved in April and May. And then in June of 2023, I brought those same animals back now as cow-calf pairs with 3 bulls this time, and put them back into the pasture and also did the rotational grazing with them. How I set up my rotational grazing is, you can see in this picture that these red lines here represent barbed wire fences that were already in place. And I certainly didn't want to ask the ranch staff to dismantle any of their physical fences, especially nothing that's alongside a road. So rather than being able to put them in a big empty field and move them around, I used virtual fencing to subdivide these physical pastures into smaller subpastures. So these yellow solid lines here represent the virtual fencing pasture boundaries. And then what I did is, I started the cows out on one end of the pasture down here. And then every 5 to 7 days, whenever it looked like they'd used up the grass in their pasture, I would use virtual fencing to rotate them into the next area. And then the next area, and the next area, and so on and so forth. And then in the first year when they were heifers, because they'd never used the system before, they were given quite a long training period to get used to it. They got an 11-day training period. And then the following year, when the same cows came back as cow-calf pairs, they were only given 3 days for a retraining period. So how did that go? Well, it went surprisingly well, and I will be the first person to admit that when we did a winter technical trial, that was, in a different with different cows, and it wasn't part of the rotational grazing trial. I expected that the collars would probably work for a couple of weeks in the winter, and that the batteries would just slowly die over time, and then that would be that. But much to my surprise, over summer and winter, all of the virtual fencing collar batteries stayed over 80% charged. And that's especially impressive in the winter when you consider that it was 2 months of grazing through December and January. Temperatures definitely reached like negative 35 degrees. And, there was less than 8 hours of sunlight per day. But even though the collars charged more slowly in the winter, they were still able to consistently stay above 80% charged throughout both trials. So that was really cool and unexpected and really encouraging, especially because Katie had mentioned that there might be some people who are interested in winter grazing options, and virtual fencing is a really great potential tool for managing winter grazing. We did have some, individual collar failures, but what we saw was that even if one or two collars in the herd wasn't working for a day or a few days or even a month, it really didn't impact the rest of the virtual fencing success on the rest of the herd. So over the course of the 2 years, there were about 4 cows that managed to scrape off their collar, or in some way their collar fell off. This picture is from one area where we found one of these orphaned collars, and I think it's no surprise to anybody looking at this picture that a determined cow was able to scratch a collar off of her neck. But thanks to the nature of the GPS collar and some Bluetooth capabilities of the collars, they were really easy to find, and we never lost a single collar permanently. We did have a few network problems, so like network connectivity problems, but none of them lasted for more than a few days, I'm pretty sure. And again, they just didn't really impact the general virtual fencing success. And then inevitably, with using a new technology, we had, one pretty good user error failure, and then there was one collar where the hardware ended up failing, but it was covered under warranty, so we just got a new collar. So this is so one of the things we looked at was, how did the cows interact with the virtual fencing? How many audio warnings did they get? How many electric shocks did they get? And if they learned to use this virtual fencing system, you should see that they get fewer electric shocks over time. And looking at, so on this left-hand side here, we have the number of electric shocks that each individual cow received over each day throughout the course of 2022. And over on the right, we have the number of audio warnings that each cow received each day. And what we noticed was that there were sort of like a few different types of cow personalities and how they interacted with the virtual fencing. So the majority of the animals are like the ones who are circled here in orange, where they were kind of like the moderate behaviors. Over here, you can see that this cow, you know, even received more audio warnings over time. But then some cows, the cows that were in this more moderate category were the ones that learned to receive a lot fewer shocks over time, or, just generally didn't get that many shocks anyways. So they were like the average behaviors. Some cows, like these ones circled in blue, seem to be really shy and hesitant of the virtual fencing system, and were actually able to avoid getting almost any audio warnings at all. And even if they did get some shocks at the beginning, also were very avoidant of receiving any electric shocks. So these are sort of like the nervous Nellies. We think that we think that the cows were able to watch the other cows receiving shocks and warnings, and so avoid that. And that's a really interesting um, area for research, but I didn't look into that. And then finally, you get the cows here who are circled in red, who were kind of the boneheads of the group, so to speak. And they were the ones who got a lot of warnings all the time and who got a lot more shocks than the rest of the cows all the time. And these cows are the troublemakers, whether you're looking at a physical fence system or a virtual fence system. And what we didn't see, though, is that these troublemaker cows escaped any more or less often than any of the other cows. So that was cool to see. Speaking of learning virtual fencing system, uh, one of the things that I really wanted to look at was what happens when you take cows and you put them in a virtual fencing system and they figure it out and that's all good. And then you take them out because you have a different winter feeding system, right? And they're out of the pasture for like 6 or 8 months. And then you put them back in the pasture and try to use virtual fencing on them again. How much training do they need? Do they remember the virtual fence? So that's what we did. And what we saw was in the first year of 2022, the heifers who were naive to the system, they really quickly learned to receive fewer shocks. So in the training period, they were receiving shocks, maybe 20% of the time that they got an audio warning. And then by the rotational grazing period, that dropped all the way down to 5%. So they quickly learned to use the virtual fence system. And then in August, they were taken out off the pasture. And then what? 7, 8 months later, they came back in June. And what we saw was from the very get-go, those same animals who hadn't used virtual fencing in 8 months were highly successful at avoiding electric shocks and remembered how to use the system and remembered what the audio warnings meant. So this was really cool, especially if you're thinking about practical implications, because it wouldn't be very practical to use the system if you had to spend a week or 2 weeks training your livestock every spring before putting them out on pasture. So this was a little bit unexpected and really encouraging to see as well. My main question, of course, for my thesis, some of these were interesting side questions. My main question was, can we use this technology for rotational grazing? And not just for the heifers, but in 2023, we had cow-calf pairs. And when we had cow-calf pairs, the cows all had a they all had a virtual fencing collar, but the calves were uncollared, so they could go wherever they wanted. And we expected that would mean that the cows it would be less successful to use virtual fencing on cows when their calves could go wherever they wanted. If a calf wandered into the exclusion zone, then, maybe the cow would break through the barrier to go join their calf. But that's not what we saw. Um, from my data, we saw that both heifers and the cows with the uncollared calves stayed within the virtual fence boundaries over 99% of the time over the course of the 3 months of rotational grazing. So that was really cool, and really encouraging. We did definitely get some escapes. I would say that about half of our cows escaped, at least once at one time or the other. And when a cow escaped, we didn't, chase after it and put it back in the pasture. We just let it wander around and do its thing. And what we saw was that the cows, after they'd escaped, they would wander around where they weren't supposed to be for an hour or two, and then they would just walk back into the virtual pasture like the rest, to join the rest of the herd, and then the collars would start working again like normal. And once a cow had escaped once, it's not like they learned they could escape and they suddenly became escape artists. Most cows, if they escaped, they only escaped once. And the highest number we ever got was one cow escaped 3 times in 1 year. So that was no problem. And finally, we also wanted to see if virtual fencing had any effect on the welfare or the production of the cows that we were using it on, because of course we know that producers aren't going to want to invest in a technology that's going to, reduce the health or the production of their livestock. And what we saw was that the number of shocks and the number of warnings that a cow got, even if they were, the worst cow in the bunch and they got more shocks than anybody else, the number of shocks and warnings had no effect on the weight gain of the heifers or the cows, the pregnancy rate of the heifers or the cows, or the average daily gain of their calves. So that was great. Um, so those were all of the planned parts of my thesis research, but when you're working with livestock, there are lots of unplanned things that happen. And so I want to give you an example from that. Throughout my research, the every couple of weeks, all of the cows had to be rounded up and brought sort of like to another part of the site for like to go through a chute and get their blood drawn for a totally different study. And then they would just be brought back and put back in the pasture they needed to be in. But as sometimes happens, some miscommunication happened, and my cows were supposed to be put back in this pasture in the southeast, but instead they were put in the wrong pasture up here in the northwest. Uh, and so I was actually out of town this day. I was in Olds College I was out of town doing a presentation. And so rather than asking the ranch staff to head out there with people in quads and chase around these flighty heifers trying to get them all the way over into this pasture, I decided to try to use virtual fencing first. So what I did is I drew a very weird shaped virtual pasture, which was basically a very wide track of where I wanted my cows to go. And then I just waited. And as the cows naturally moved along towards, the only open area, I just adjusted the virtual fencing boundary behind them so that they couldn't turn around and go back the other way. And it took about an hour or two, but I just checked my phone, every 30 minutes or so to see where they were and what kind of progress they made. And over a bit of time, the cows walked along naturally to where I wanted them, and I followed up behind them with the virtual fence until they ended up in the pasture where they were supposed to be. And it was great. It worked perfectly. I didn't have to bug the ranch staff, and I did that myself from like 200 kilometers away in another town. So that was really neat. Um, And then another application that I ended up using virtual fencing for was water access. So the 2 years that I did my degree or did my research, they were kind of dry years and they had come on the tail of a few dry years for us. And the southeast pasture had water and the northwest pasture had water, but this pasture in the northeast, the water had dried up. There was nothing there for the cows to drink. So what I ended up doing was using virtual fencing so that when the cows were grazing this northeast pasture, they were able to go back through this open physical gate and access only a small portion of that pasture so that they could access that water. So when I wanted them on the east side, that's what that looked like. And when I wanted them on the west side, that's what the pasture looked like. And this also worked remarkably well. And we ended up doing that in some other areas of the ranch too for some unexpected water problems and using that to give the cattle access to water. So I just gave you a whole bunch of like charts and data and stuff to look at. So I want to show you an example of sort of two different types of behaviors that my heifers had when they got shocked by virtual fencing for the first time. So these are my heifers. This is probably the first shock or maybe two shocks that they ever got. The sound is probably going to be really quiet, so if you can turn it up on your end, feel free to, but you'll be able to see the reaction. So I'm going to start with this heifer on the left. And so you saw she flinched when she got the shock, and then the other cow that was near her didn't really react much at all. And so just a few minutes later, and then there they all go. So only one cow or one heifer in that group actually got a shock, but they all reacted as if, something crazy had happened to them and they all ran off. So that's sort of what drives some of these data differences and data variability in how cows react to shocks and warnings. There's just a lot of individualistic uh, changes, or there's a lot of individual differences in how cows react and behave. Okay, so that's a very fast overview of what I did for my study. And normally I would ask if anybody had any questions, but I think I'm going to save questions till the end just so that I don't run out of the time for the rest of my presentation. So that is one specific application of the no fence technology in Western Canada, and it worked great. But there are a lot of other people who are using virtual fencing in different ways, and I wanted to just give you an idea of how else virtual fencing is being used. So one example is virtual fencing has been used in the States to do targeted grazing to create like a wildfire fuel break in the sagebrush steppe area. So here on the left, you can see that this gray area is sort of like their inclusion zone or where they wanted the cows to spend time. And then this red stripy zone is their boundary zone. So they had a virtual fence boundary somewhere in there. And they were actually quite successful in using cows to graze this fuel break. The cows spent the vast majority of their time in this, fuel break area, and they were able to graze it, pretty close down to the dirt and get rid of a lot of the litter and the, other fine fuel that's bad for wildfires. And with the last few years, all the wildfires across Canada that have been going on, I think this is a really interesting application, both for, individual landowners who are maybe looking to wildfire proof their properties, but also just generally for, land managers or governments or for a more broad approach to wildfire safety. Virtual fencing is also being used in targeted grazing for encroaching species, woody species, invasive species, that sort of thing. So this is an example of a group in Norway. I should also say that this was using the Vents virtual fencing technology. This one's using the no fence again. And they were using goats to graze up these encroaching junipers and to clear up some of the fine fuels that are all around that, like the litter that create the wildfire risk. And yeah, it was very successful. The goats ate exactly what they wanted them to eat and only escaped a few times, as goats are want to do. Another application is the exclusion of cattle from areas that are sensitive or that you don't want them to graze in. So in this example, a group in Australia planted tree saplings up in this like northwest corner of a pasture and used virtual fencing to prevent the cows from going in and, grazing all these sensitive young saplings. And despite there being some trouble in week 6, where they had some collar malfunctions, they were very successful in keeping cows out of this sensitive area. And the study was published in 2020, so this was very early days of virtual fencing technology. This is a really good example. Myself and my colleagues took these photos. It's not part of a published study yet, but if my colleague ever gets around to it, it will be. And basically we used virtual fencing to exclude cattle from grazing riparian areas. So this picture here is, I think, the best one. These two pictures were taken, I was standing in the same spot, and this picture was taken looking, I think, north. And this area was excluded from grazing by virtual fencing. I was like standing on the virtual fencing borderline. And then this picture was taken looking south at the area where grazing was allowed. And as you can see, even though there's still some evidence that either maybe livestock or wildlife, got into this exclusion area, the health condition of these two halves of the riparian area are, night and day. There's a lot of bare soil here. There's a lot of trampling and hummocking and pugging, whereas at least here it's mostly vegetated and there's a lot more vegetation. And then here on the right is the same idea. It's just deferred grazing in a riparian area. So this is a site that cattle had been excluded from for 4 weeks. And then they were allowed in here to graze for 2 weeks after that. And you can see that there is a big difference in vegetation. And this is maybe less relevant for you folks on the east, but I get a lot of questions from people in BC who ask if virtual fencing can be used in mountainous terrain. And so this is just an example of a group in Switzerland who successfully used virtual fencing to rotationally graze in a Swiss mountain pasture. So I just spent, 35 minutes singing the praises of virtual fencing, and it is really cool and it does work very well. But there's definitely limitations and challenges, especially considering that it's a new technology, where people are still really ironing out some of the wrinkles. So one of the biggest challenges or limiting factors to virtual fencing right now is cellular network availability and GPS accuracy. So cellular network availability is patchy all across Canada. Lots of people don't have cell network. eShepherd gets around that by the use of base stations, but then base stations, of course, are an additional cost to a virtual fencing system. GPS accuracy can be affected by things in the environment, like the topography of your land, canopy covers, so really dense forests can interfere with GPS accuracy, etc. Virtual fencing is not able to completely replace fences. In particular, you still need to have sort of that perimeter physical fence for safety to keep your cattle more contained to your area. This is important, especially important if you're, next to a road or something. But in particular, and this is something I learned the hard way, virtual fencing does not work on your neighbor's cows. So it happened a few times during my project that my cattle were behaving and, being exactly where I needed them to be, but the neighbor's cows had broken out of their fence and into my fence, and it took several hours to split up the cows and get them back to where they belong. So that is also something to keep in mind. I already mentioned that commercially there's only one technology available in Canada right now. Hopefully that improves in the next year or two, but right now we only have one. The initial cost can be a challenge for some people, although we all know that fencing is expensive too. And then there's also a little bit of expectations versus reality when it comes to this technology. And I think it's really important for people to understand what can be done and what can't be done with this sort of new technology. Because that way, it's only going to lead to disappointment if you purchase an expensive technology, hoping that it can do something that it was never really designed to do. And then with any new tech, there's going to be, the learning curve of implementing it, setting it up properly, managing it. So in this case, the livestock training aspects, the pasture design, where do you put your base stations? How do you put on a collar? That sort of thing. Despite these challenges and tribulations, there are a lot of people doing some really great work in making virtual fencing accessible to more people. And I highly encourage anybody who's considering using this technology to look up the Rangelands Gateway virtual fencing user guide. So this is out of the University of Arizona and then a few other partners. And I'll just give you a little idea of what that looks like. So this is the website. And it's just a, a a whole bunch of resources and how-tos and tools that you can use when looking into virtual fencing. So they have a series of written resources about the foundations of virtual fencing, the economics of it, strategies for collar management, the basics, training and animal welfare, etc. They have some really excellent videos that, are everything from just a demonstration video to how-tos and how to get started, how to get it set up. So they have a whole bunch of videos, more than just is listed here. And then they've created some really neat tools. One of them is that vendor comparison spreadsheet I had showed you earlier in my presentation. Just, the matrix comparing different technologies, but they also have a virtual fence cost calculator. And I'll just click here. It is done in US dollars, but you can do the go from US to Canadian dollars yourself if you're curious. And it basically says size of your pasture, number of cows, miles of fence, etc. And then it lets you compare vents, no fence, e-shepherd, and halter to that, if you had one pasture that's so big. In terms of looking at this from a rotational grazing point of view, you're not able to input the number of miles of cross fencing that you use. It just goes based on your pasture size. So if you have a 100-acre pasture that you break up into 4 pieces, you can't just say that this is 100 acres and you use, a certain number of miles of fence because it calculates the miles for you separately. You have to input each pasture on its own and then add those costs together to really be able to compare. So yeah, I highly encourage you to look at that website and look at their resources. I'm pretty sure this webinar is being recorded, so I wanted to give you a slide with the sources to all those studies that I cited. So you can come back and take a look at any of these studies that you're interested in reading up on. And, a quick shout out to the funders who were the reason that I could do this sort of cutting edge virtual fencing thesis research in the first place. And I am happy and excited to take any questions that you might have.
Alex, there's a bunch in the chat.
Oh.
Do you want me to read those out, or do you want people to unmute themselves and ask, or how do we want to go about this?
Yeah, you feel free to, I should be able to look at the chat myself. If I stopped sharing, I guess I could, but I may want to start sharing again to answer a question, but I can look at the chat. Okay.
So starting with, first question up was, do all cows
Huh.
need the collar?
Yeah, I've got the chat up now. So this is a really good question and is the subject of a couple of papers. Right now, the official answer from all of the virtual fencing companies is that yes, every adult animal needs their own collar. Calves outside don't, or lambs or whatever. However, there's been a few people looking at, can you get away with only collaring half of your animals? Or what happens if 10% of your collars break? So the functional answer says that definitely you need more than half of your livestock to be collared if you're looking to control where they're grazing. If you just want to collect data about where they are, if you are looking for pasture utilization data or keeping track of your animals, you maybe only need to put a collar on 5 of them or 10 of them. But for controlling grazing, at least half, I think at least 3/4 of animals will need to be collared, and it is best to have all of them collared. Yeah. Can it work near roads, and do cows need to be trained? Yes, cows need to be trained, certainly in their first year of using it, and then whether or not they remember that into the next year. My cows did. It might not be the case for everybody's animals, so that's a bit of a try it and see. And then in terms of can it work near roads, you do still need physical perimeter fencing for safety and for preventing other animals from messing with your cows. You can't just use virtual fencing without any physical fence. Um, I'm curious about limitations. For example, in the farm webinar earlier today, they said that the software sends a signal every 30 minutes. So if you make a mistake with the boundary, it can be an issue because you may not be able to fix it right away. I think that was no fence. Hi, so was that Dr. Bork? Dr. Edward Bork was probably talking about that in that webinar. Um, so he was my supervisor, and if that was him who was talking about it, then the caller is scheduled to send an update every 30 minutes, but you can like with a no fence technology, but then you can also open the app and refresh it and like force a signal to go through. So if you do make a mistake with a pasture boundary and you need to change it, or if you want to see a updated idea of where are all your cows, you can hit like a refresh button and it forces an additional signal to go through. However, if you have inconsistent cellular network connection or if you have an inconsistent connection, that can cause some problems where like half of the callers might update and the other half might not. So whether you're using cellular network or the base stations, it is important to make sure you have good communication between the software and the callers. For eShepherd and Vents and the other technologies, they're pretty tight-lipped about exactly how their technologies work unless you have already bought their technology. So I don't have a ton of details about things like how often do the callers communicate and that sort of thing. But my colleagues who are using eShepherd have said that it works really well and is similar to No Fence. And I don't know anybody personally who's using Vents yet, so I couldn't say. And then I hope I addressed your question about other limitations in that last slide of mine. Okay, and then somebody just updated the eShepherd cost with Canadian dollars. Okay, cool. Collars are $415 each if you order between 20 and 60. How do the cows know you moved the fence? That is a really good question. And one of my favorite parts of this whole research was what we found is we would we would have the virtual fence boundary. And what the cows would do is they would walk up to the boundary and then they would hear the audio warning. And the audio warning was about 5 to 10 seconds long. And it had a really predictable, it would start at a low pitch and end at a very high pitch, and then the cows would get a shock. So the grazing animals would walk up to the boundary, start hearing the audio warning, and keep grazing until the very last second, and then they would move away just before they got the electric shock. So then when we moved the boundary, the cows who were going up to that area anyways didn't run into the audio warning, so they just kept going across what used to be a virtual fence boundary until, they heard the audio warning again. So it's almost like they were kind of using the warnings as an echolocation to map out where these boundaries were. Let's see.
The next in the queue, somebody made a comment. I wonder how our situation here compares for sun in the winter for charging.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The less than 8 hours a day of sunlight is in the open prairies, in the middle of the continent. So, and relatively far north, like, I was a little bit north of Edmonton doing this research. So I'm not sure how much sun you folks get in the winter on the East Coast. And I think, hmm?
It rains a lot.
Yeah, I was gonna say, weather uh, weather would impact that a lot, both from cloud coverage, but also just the impact of ice and like freezing rain and that sort of thing. I know you deal with that a lot more than we do. Um, so I'm not sure how that would affect the collar's ability to work over your winter. What I will say is the no fence collars, and also I think the e-shepherd collars as well, are pretty waterproof. We had some hot summers and our cows were fully laying down in the dugouts with the collars fully submerged, for multiple days in a row when it was really hot out, and we didn't lose any collars to water damage. So it's not the same as ice, but I think the potential is there, and hopefully somebody in your area will try it and see, and then communicate the results to the rest of you. Um, Wait a second. When you brought the cows back in 2023, were the boundaries the same as in 2022? They were similar, but not the same. And I ended up grazing the pastures in a different order than the first year because of how the grass was growing. So there were some similarities, and that very well could have helped the cows remember, how the virtual fencing system worked. But they were not exactly the same, no. Um, how far away do the calves wander from the cows? On a smaller pastures, are the calves going to overgraze before or after the cows? I'll get somebody just put their hand up and maybe I'll answer this question and then we can take their question after this. The calves, we didn't have any collars on the calves, so we couldn't track their movements using GPS. Just through observation, the calves mostly stayed within, you know, 50 feet, I'd say, of the herd in general, but especially towards the end of the summer when the calves were getting a little bit older, there were calves who were clear across the other side of the pasture for part of the day. And I did see, one cow was certainly calling for her calf at one point, standing on the boundary, but she never did end up escaping. So either the calf came back in quickly enough, or I doubt she gave up on her calf, but we didn't really see too many escapes. And then, whether the calves are going to overgraze the pasture, yeah, that's going to depend more on the size of your pasture and how fast you need to get your cows out of there. So the smaller the pasture, the faster that'll happen. Um,
Want to take the
mhm,
question with the raised hand?
mhm.
Hey Alexandra, well, thank you so much for your presentation, and it was really helpful. My name is Rahul. I'm the founder of a startup called Ranch Flow. We are based out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and we are building like we've already have our product out in the market for smart livestock collars, like which gives producers real-time visibility, like grazing behavior, animal herd health, and all sort of details which are required, like rumination, the time which was spent in moving. And currently, our team is working on creating virtual fencing system within our existing hardware. And hopefully by the first quarter of 2026, you'll have another company offering the solution in Canada and Canadian company.
Sure. Yeah, what was the name of your company that you just said?
It's called Ranch Flow. I'll,
Ranch Flow.
yeah, I'll put it in chat as well.
Cool. Yeah. I would love for there to be a Canadian technology or a Canadian solution to the, somewhat unique Canadian problems that, Europe or the US don't really encounter as much. So thanks for sharing that. That's cool.
Absolutely. And I just had a quick question since we are pretty much close with the hardware part of our technology. Just building on the firmware, I have like our team had some concerns regarding animal welfare and behavior. So there were a lot of researches, but we weren't able to see certain details about what combination of cues like audio and then vibration and then pulse, electric shock, like what's the best combination? And in terms of electric shock, what's the maximum shock in terms of pulse is allowed from the government? Is there any specific regulation we should take care of or look into?
Those are great questions. I don't work in the like software or the hardware development side of things, so I don't know about government regulations and about specifics like maximum, voltage for shocks and whatever. I don't have those answers, but uh, what what the research has shown is that audio warnings only aren't enough to control where cattle go. You need an audio warning paired with some kind of other stimulus. The uh, the technology that has an audio warning followed by an electric shock is very, very effective at controlling livestock movement, and so far has had no discernible impact on animal welfare, for like looking at things like heart rate and weight gain and production and that sort of thing. So the existing technologies that use electric shocks are really safe for livestock use. Halter might be looking into vibration or using vibration for active herding, but they're not active in Canada, and I don't have any experience with them, so I couldn't really say much about vibration. So yeah, thanks for those questions.
Thank you so much.
How narrow were you able to draw your boundaries before the cattle became confused and don't respect the line? That is a great question, and it partially depends on how accurate your GPS is in that area. So the worse your GPS accuracy is, the wider you need to draw your virtual fence boundaries away from each other, or else, the cows do start getting confused if they're stuck in this small corridor and then they're in the middle of it and no matter where they turn, they might be getting an audio warning. So each technology will come with a user manual that says, your pastures should be, minimum this wide, or your corridors should be minimum this wide. In my experience, having like at least 30 meters is a pretty safe bet if you're thinking that, there might be 5 to 10 meters of GPS uncertainty depending on where you are. So 30 meters is what I used for my pastures. It kind of depends on where you are and which technology you're using. And again, it's a bit of a trial and error to see what works for your cows and your landscape. How well does the fence work for strip grazing? Great question. And there's somebody in Alberta who is doing a project on that right now. Their results aren't published yet, but just from talking to them, um, they were able to they were definitely able to use virtual fencing to manage a strip grazing over winter. The only thing to keep in mind is that it depends on how far you're trying to move your fence every time you move your cows. So if you're moving your fence, 30 meters every day or, how every 3 days, that works really quite well. But if you're only moving your fence 10 meters a day, then that's sort of too small of an area to reliably know that the cows will have access to that additional 10 meters of space, just because there's that buffer zone around a virtual boundary, due to GPS, accuracy and whatnot. If a predator such as a bear enters the virtual fence area and the cows storm past, how do they respond? Do they storm past the line, or how do they respond to the challenge? Great question. Thankfully, I didn't have any problems with bears during my study, but what I did have was a massive thunderstorm that just about turned into a tornado, actually. And what we found was the cow, like about half the herd, uh, basically just like ran right through the virtual fence boundary onto the other side of the pasture. There was a few more trees on the other side of the pasture. So I think whoever didn't have shelter during the storm, ran through the boundary, went to those trees for shelter. They stayed there overnight and sheltered the storm there. And then in the morning, they just walked back over to the other side of the boundary, back into the virtual pasture, and joined their buddies. And most of those cows didn't escape again throughout the the grazing. So there are things that will cause a cow to run through a virtual boundary, but there's also things that will make cows run right through physical fences. And the good thing is, when a cow runs through a virtual boundary, A, you're tracking them so you know where they are. And then B, you don't have to go fix your fence afterwards, unlike if somebody puts a hole in your fence. So, yeah, big things can still make them escape, but it's not the end of the world, or it wasn't in my study. And then would you be able to use this with an AMP grazing system? And can you pre-program the moves? And if so, how many? Yes, I would say that an AMP grazing system is exactly the type of application that virtual fencing is good for. Currently, none of the technologies offer the sort of pre-programmed moves, or offer that sort of ability to schedule your cow movements. Some people I've heard say that they don't like the idea of taking the human management out of the livestock grazing, and they don't want, to have too much of a hands-off product. And then another company that I was talking to said that that's just not something that they're interested in implementing right now. They're doing other software updates, but that it's not off the table in the future. So currently you're not able to schedule moves, but you may be able to, in the next few years. And that is all the questions that are in the chat. So if anybody else has something else, feel free to.
There's one more in the Q&A. There's a question. Any idea why the no fence is so much cheaper than the eShepherd system based on the comparison you listed?
Good question. Let me go take another look at the comparison just so I can see what the actual numbers are. I know that vents in the States, let me take a look at this comparison so I know what I'm talking about. I've heard that vents has been adjusting their prices, trying to be, yeah. So vents is in the States, and you don't purchase the collars from them. So you just pay $40 per collar per year to like lease the collars, so to speak. And so I think eShepherd, because they're operating in Canada as a competitor with vents, they've been adjusting their prices to be more competitive with vents. Whereas No Fence, who is operating in the States too, but just not in Canada yet. I think No Fence, it has been trying to operate like a kind of a different niche area. So the last time I spoke with No Fence, they said that they're targeting more of the smaller operations, the people who have like 5 to 200 cows and who maybe do more of a complex grazing, have more complex grazing goals, but with a smaller number of animals. Whereas Vence has really been marketing itself towards the big producers in the States who maybe have 3 or 4 or 500 head of cattle that they're only grazing for, 3 months, and they're not doing really complicated stuff with. So I think it's a matter of target customers, and then also eShepherd is probably trying to be competitive with Vents at this point. Yeah, really good question.
Any other questions, whether you pop them in the chat or if you want to unmute yourself to ask?
I also just popped my email in the chat too, so if you want to chat more, I'm happy to chat about virtual fencing.
Just a comment. I watched a webinar from eShepherd. You can build multiple paddocks and then switch from paddock to paddock quickly. The old paddock closes once the last cow moves to the new paddock.
Okay. That sounds similar to how I did my no fence pastures, but when I was doing them, I did kind of have to do it by hand, so to speak. But I wrapped up my field work over 2.5 years ago now. It's been since I did my field work, and I know that all of the technologies have made a lot of changes over the last few years and upgrades to how their software works and their system works. So yeah, I'd be very curious to see how eShepherd is handling those details about how cattle actually get from point A to point B.
Well, thank you. I learned lots. I'm sure everybody else did as well. So yeah, would love to hear from you again. So, all right. Thanks,
Cool.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.